Subscribers to this channel know that I hope to use several strategies to protect the health of my portfolio in retirement. I hope to use a more conservative withdrawal rate than the widely touted 4% rule. I hope to use a flexible spending strategy that I've described in several prior videos. I've also mentioned that I would use a bond tent. What is a bond tent? It's the idea that a retiree can protect their portfolio by allocating more to bonds and less to stocks in the years surrounding their retirement date. The basic idea is that we should make our portfolios more conservative in those sensitive years surrounding retirement. That is, our peak bond allocation should be centered on our year of retirement. By the end of this video, you should have the confidence to test for yourself whether a bond tent strategy might help you or not. If it's not clear why the years surrounding a person's retirement are sensitive years, I suggest watching some of my prior videos about sequence of returns risk. One of the key messages of those prior videos is that a market crash that occurs near a retirement date can hurt more than an equal crash that occurs far away from the same retirement date. Because I try to evaluate ideas skeptically, I recently decided I should test how much bond tents might really help a retiree's portfolio. I used one of my favorite calculators, cFIREsim, to simulate various bond tent strategies. cFIREsim lets you backtest investment strategies on historical data, and it's free to use. Let me show you what I found through the simulations I ran and why I now think bond tents are sometimes not useful. If you linger to the end, you'll hear me mention two strategies that may work better. Okay, here we are on the cFIREsim website, and you can see that I'm on the Inputs tab. So I want to explain a few things about the numbers. First of all, any dollar amounts that you see in cFIREsim are in today's dollars. I'm doing this about 7 years before the hypothetical retirement year that's shown right here. The other thing that I want to point out is that for most of these numbers, you may have concerns about some of the numbers being inputted, but for the type of analysis that I'm about to show you, that doesn't matter very much. If you think like the initial yearly spending amount, for example, is inappropriate, keep in mind that what I'm about to show you are simulations that involve different bond allocations. In other words, different bond tent strategies. And I'm interested in comparing those different strategies. So it doesn't matter that much. We shouldn't get hung up on numbers that are going to be held constant or remain the same across the different bond tent strategies. What really matters is how the bond allocations change across these different simulations, because we'll learn something very important by comparing these different simulations. But just so you know, the background inputs, we're assuming a retirement that starts in 2029 and it lasts for 45 years. We're beginning with a $1.7 million portfolio, and the initial yearly spending, so the spending in the first year of retirement, is $85,000. Now that's 5% of the portfolio value. Many of us would think that imprudent, and that's fine, but it helps in the comparisons to have an initial yearly spending amount that's a little bit higher. It spreads out the results a little bit and helps us see better what's going on as we try different bond tent strategies. The yearly spending adjusts for inflation using the CPI estimate of inflation, and the standard portfolio in most years of this 45-year retirement, we will have a 60-40 stock bond allocation. Now, how do you simulate a bond tent? Well, we're actually going to simulate the second half of the bond tent. Down here in this box where it says keep allocation constant, we're not going to keep the allocation constant. We're going to deselect that and then create what's called a glide path. From 2029 to 2039, in this specific example, for this specific simulation, we're going to have a starting allocation of 50-50, which is more conservative. And then what happens over this 10-year glide path, which is the second half of the bond tent, what happens is the allocation gradually shifts to a 60-40 allocation. So the numbers you're seeing right here are for one of the more conservative simulations that I'll run. But I'll show you the results of several simulations in a table in order to save time. Okay, we're going to run the simulation now, and remember, most of the numbers don't change across the different simulations that I'm going to show you, or the results of different simulations that I'm going to show you. But for this simulation in which the glide path or bond allocation starts at a 50-50 allocation, we see that we have an 81% success rate. What's a success rate? It means the probability that the portfolio lasts throughout the 45-year retirement period. And we also have these other numbers that help us interpret the wisdom of this strategy. I like to look at the median ending portfolio value. So this is like an estimate of how much extra money the retiree is likely to have during retirement. In other words, if they stuck really strictly to their spending pattern and never noticed that their portfolio was increasing in value, they would end up with somewhere around 3.2 million extra dollars. Now that's the median or 50th percentile. I also like to look down here at the 10th percentile, and you can see that with that glide path starting at a 50-50 stock to bond allocation, down at the 10th percentile, the retiree with unlucky start years or unlucky historical cycles, the retiree is likely to end up with no money at death, because in fact almost 19% of the time the retiree runs out of money before dying. Now, to test the results of different bond tent or glide path strategies, I ran dozens of simulations, but I'm not going to waste your time showing you a whole bunch of different output screens. I've instead created a table of just a handful of those simulations because they're representative of what I discovered, and I think they contain a very important message for all of us to consider. Let me orient you to this table. First, these green cells represent inputs that were used for the 5 simulations that are captured in this table. And remember, most of the numbers in these simulations I kept constant. In other words, I didn't change them because what I was really interested in doing was comparing different bond tent strategies. So the glide path was always the same. The stock to bond allocation at the end of the 10-year period, by 2039, it was always a 60-40 stock bond allocation. But what I changed was the beginning of the glide path, how conservative the bond allocation was. Or in other words, I changed the stock to bond allocation at the beginning of this hypothetical retiree's retirement. And the pattern that you can see here is that I kept making the bond allocation less and less conservative. I started with a 70% allocation to bonds, which corresponds with a 30% allocation to stocks, and then I dropped the bond allocation on the next simulation, dropped it more on the next simulation, dropped it more, and then I broke from the linear pattern and just got curious. What happens when you have a 0% allocation to bonds in the retiree's retirement year 2029? The striking finding for me was that the probability of success rises as the allocation to bonds diminishes. In other words, as the allocation to stocks increases, the probability of success increases. Now, I'm not going to present an argument that everybody should have a 100% allocation to stocks. It's not what I think is appropriate in most circumstances, but I think if there's one thing that we should draw from analyses like this, it's that we should all be testing our assumptions. Because what I found out is that a bond tent can be counterproductive in some instances. With more conservative allocations, you may have a lower probability of success. You may also end up with less extra money during retirement if you have too conservative an allocation at the beginning.
Well, what do you think about bond tents? I hope you noticed I didn't say they were a universally bad idea. They invoke a wide range of opinions on discussion fora in the financial independence community, and I now see why. They might be useful in a few circumstances, but the many situations I've now analyzed in cFIREsim suggest that bond tents are sometimes counterproductive. Now let me tell you about a friend of mine who is in a scenario in which a more conservative allocation near his retirement date could actually make a lot of sense. He has a unique retirement account that his employer expects him to annuitize. There are incentives attached to the account if he annuitizes it at his retirement date. Now, there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical of annuities, but when they make sense, it also makes sense to think carefully about one's allocation leading up to the retirement date. Most of us would be distressed to discover, for example, that their account value was down 30% in the months leading up to the retirement date. In situations like that, a more conservative allocation can make a lot of sense to protect against having to lock in an annuity while the account value is depressed. So there must be unique circumstances in which greatly boosting the bond allocation in an account for some period is advantageous. But the dozens of analyses that I have now run through cFIREsim tell me that bond tent strategies can be counterproductive. Are there any strategies that work better? Well, I don't know about your individual circumstances, and I can't tell you what's best for you, and I can't provide financial advice, but I can tell you what I've learned for myself. Using a more conservative withdrawal rate, like 3.5% instead of 4% in the initial year of retirement, may substantially protect a retiree's portfolio. Also, using a dynamic spending strategy instead of blindly adjusting for inflation can also provide robust protection for a retiree's portfolio. If these two strategies interest you, check out my links to other videos in the video description. Thanks for watching.